Now, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Scott Guile. I am the Executive Marketing Manager for Economics at Macmillan, joined by Greg Mankiw and Carolyn Merrill. Carolyn is the Senior Executive Program Manager at Macmillan for Economics. It's my pleasure to introduce Greg today. He is the Robert M. Barron Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he's been a faculty member since 1985. At the time, I believe one of the youngest, if not the youngest ever, tenured faculty member. One of the most influential economists of our time, renowned not only for cutting-edge research in macro and economic policy, but also for exceptional contributions to economics education. In addition to academic work, Dr. Mankiw served as a public servant, most notably as the chairman of the Council of the Economic Advisors under George W. Bush. Today, Greg will be sharing his expertise and offering us insight that blend understanding of the theory and his experience with that policy making. And we are truly fortunate to have this time with him today. So thank you very much, Greg, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be with you all virtually. The topic I want to talk about today is a crucial one, I think, and it's well summarized by this cartoon. Those of you who use my intermediate macro book will recognize this cartoon as one of the features of the government debt chapter. And it's not a particularly funny cartoon, I don't think, but I think it does sort of summarize this important policy issue that we're basically leaving a debt to our children. You can't legally leave a negative bequest to your children, but you can if it's done through the government. And that is essentially what we are doing through running up very large budget deficits, both in the past and in the future. So let me just sort of start by sort of setting the stage with some data. What you see here is another picture from my intermediate macro book, shows the ratio of government debt. This is just the debt held by the public, so it doesn't include the Social Security Trust Fund. So this is the debt held by the public as a ratio to GDP. And what you see is that this has fluctuated a lot throughout history. It tends to go up in crises. Two kinds of crises are wars and economic crises. So you see these spikes in the debt to GDP ratio during all the major wars, during the Great Depression, during the Great Recession, and of course during the COVID-19 downturn, where we spent lots of money to alleviate some of the hardship associated with the sharp and very deep recession. We're now very close to the all-time high for government debt, and so that by itself is a little troubling. But what's really more troubling is the trajectory that we are on. So if we were basically at high level now, but we were going back down towards normal, you'd say, okay, well, that's kind of normal. We go up in crises and then we go debt declines during normal times. But even though we're predicting normal times, we're not predicting another crisis. We're expecting the debt to continue rising. So here is a picture from the Congressional Budget Office that basically shows the same thing, a shorter time period. But again, we have high levels of debt historically, and going forward, this debt will just continue rising. Even though there's no deep recession forecast, there's no war forecast, it's the debt to GDP ratios is continuing to rise because we're running big budget deficits on normal times. Now, like a lot of economists, I've been worried about this trajectory for a long time. And you can see this has been that's been rising for a long time. And I've been sort of writing about it off and on really throughout my career. I wrote an article in 2011 in the New York Times. And the article was a discussion of a potential future debt crisis. And it was written in the form of a speech that some future president would give when the US economy experienced a debt crisis, when the bond market suddenly looked at this trajectory and said, oh, we don't trust the United States anymore. And so it was a fun article to write because it was this hypothetical speech. I didn't know when the speech should occur. I just sort of set it 15 years ahead. So I was writing this in 2011. And so I set this in 2026, roughly where we are now. I was just guessing that maybe that's how long ago on. I really had no idea. But after that came out in the New York Times, I got this very nice email from Alice Rivlin, who you may know is was the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office. She's now passed away, but she was really one of the great public service economists of her generation. And And she wrote me this very nice email. She said, great piece in the New York Times on the debt, but I doubt markets will give us 15 years, maybe 5. So there she was in 2011 when things weren't quite as serious as they are now. But she was thinking we'd have a debt crisis in about 5 years. Obviously, we didn't. We've made almost for the 15 years. So when are we going to have this debt crisis? I don't know, and I think it's very hard to know. A lot of this has to do with market psychology. When does the bond markets look at us and say, "Gee, I don't trust the United States anymore"? So I don't know if this debt crisis will happen soon, it'll happen in the future, or whether we'll manage to avert it through good public policy. Well, of course, we're in the middle of a political campaign right now, and because we have this serious debt problem, and everybody sort of knows about the future trajectory that we're on, the two candidates have put forward credible plans to how to bring this debt down. I'm joking, of course. What they've done is promised lots of things. So here is the estimates of how much each of the two candidates is going to increase the debt based on the promises they made during this campaign. And you can see that they're both adding a lot to the debt compared to the trajectory I've already shown you. So neither campaign has really said anything about how they're going to get this debt under control. In fact, they're promising lots of things, no tax on tips and so on, to add to this debt. So I did an interview recently with the hedge fund manager, Paul Tudor Jones, and he refers to the discussion of debt as kayfabe economic policy. Now, I didn't know the word kayfabe, so I have to actually look it up. He actually explained it in the interview, but I looked it up to learn a little more about it. And kayfabe is a term from professional wrestling. In professional wrestling, if you've ever seen it, you know it's kind of all scripted and fake. With the fact that that's scripted and fake, and obviously the performers know it's scripted and fake, and most of the audience, if they're at all intelligent, know it's scripted and fake. Everybody pretends it's real. That's kind of the pretense of professional wrestling. We all pretend this is real, even though it's not. Well, he was referring to discussion of fiscal policy as kayfabe economic policy. That is what Mr. Jones was suggesting, was that nobody really thinks these promises that have been made during the campaign are actually going to occur. They're not going to really add this much to the debt because they're going to sit down and say, no, we're already on an unsustainable path. This is making things even worse. So we all pretend these promises are real promises, but when we sit down to actually govern, most of these promises won't actually get passed by Congress, and so none of this will happen. But it is sort of noteworthy that no one who's running for president now is really taking this debt trajectory seriously and really proposing solutions to it. Now, here's a headline that came out about 6 months ago in the Wall Street Journal: surging Treasury sales unnerve investors. Annual issuance has nearly doubled since the COVID start, showing no signs of easing. And this is the kind of headline that I expect we will see more of in the years to come as we move along this trajectory of rising debt levels. And eventually something was going to have to happen. As investors get nervous, we're going to have to either have a debt crisis or do something to reassure investors that we're a responsible government and that we'll put fiscal policy back on a sustainable path. So what I'd like to do with the rest of my time with you today is to talk about the ways in which we might get out of this debt crisis. And I think, as far as I know, there are basically 5 ways to get out. I think these are comprehensive. And I want to talk about sort of each of them. And the reason I want to talk about all of them, because I want to be comprehensive, is that each of these seems implausible. But one of these things has to happen. And that's what I think is really interesting about this. Sometimes these things, or some combination of these things, are going to happen, even though each of them seems unlikely. Well, one possibility is we can simply grow very fast. Now, there is a lot of discussion about how AI is going to change the world and how growth rates are going to take off once this technology spreads. Maybe that's true. I kind of hope that's true, because the least painful way to get out of high levels of debt is to grow your income very quickly. That's true for both a government and a household. But I'm personally kind of skeptical that's going to happen. I think technologies tend to be overhyped. Daron Acemoglu, who recently won the Nobel Prize, has been writing about this recently, also being skeptical of AI's economic impact. And I hope that it has a huge economic impact. I hope we do grow very fast, but I'm not very optimistic about it. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I don't have any particular insights about AI's role in the economy, but I just want to, for completeness, I'll have to admit that fast growth would be the best way to get out of a serious debt crisis. But I don't think we should count on that. The second possibility on my list of five was default. Now, you may think that the US would never default on its debt, and certainly the bond market acts that way. It tends to have high credit ratings. But there has been situations in which the US government does default. There's a great book, which I strongly recommend, called American Default by Sebastian Edwards. And it's basically about the US going off the gold standard in the 1930s. The only thing that people forget is that there were bonds outstanding that had in them what are called gold clauses that basically allowed bondholders to redeem their payments in gold rather than in dollars. And this was basically a guarantee. It's a little bit like a form of indexation. Well, when FDR wanted to go off the gold standard, he realized that these gold clauses would be very expensive and make the whole policy of going off the gold standard perhaps untenable. And so he basically announced that, these gold clauses in these contracts, well, we're not going to honor them. That's basically a form of default. And this was a big issue of the time. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and FDR won at a very, very close vote. But I bring this up because the idea that America would never default flies in the face of history. We have defaulted in the past. Other countries, of course, have defaulted as well. Argentina multiple times. At the beginning of our republic, we had a lot of Revolutionary War debt. Alexander Hamilton argued against defaulting on it, but it was a live issue at the time. Now, might it be a live issue in the future? Well, let me give you what Donald Trump said about the debt. This is a quote back from 2016 when he was first running for president. He was asked by a reporter how he would deal with the national debt, and here's what he said. I'm not going to try to do his voice, but I do want to read it for you because I think this is a noteworthy quotation. "I'm the king of debt. I'm great with debt. Nobody knows debt better than me. I've made a fortune by using debt. And if things don't work out, I renegotiate the debt. I mean, that's a smart thing, not a stupid thing." And that, of course, sounds like Donald Trump, doesn't it? Okay, the reporter said, "How do you renegotiate the debt?" And Trump replied, "You go back and you say, hey, guess what? The economy crashed. I'm going to give you back half." That's pretty much what Argentina did. It's hard to imagine a US president actually doing the same thing, but this is what it would sound like. It's not inconceivable, I think, that the US would default on its debt. I'm not expecting it. The bond market's not expecting it, but I don't think we can completely rule it out. The third way to deal with debts is to print money. And there was a lot of talk about that a few years ago. Back when Bernie Sanders looked like a viable presidential candidate, there was a lot of talk about what's called modern monetary theory. And the modern monetary theorists were saying we never need to worry about the debt because we can always just print more money. And at the time, modern monetary theory was really the talk of the town, at least in political circles. And so I wrote a short paper, which is cited here, expressing my skepticism of modern monetary theories. So the idea that I won't go into the details of this. You can go read this paper on your own if you're still interested in modern monetary theory. I think its day in the sun has passed, but it is one of those ideas that floats around. We can just sort of print money. I think we kind of know what happens if you pursue that, and it's because other countries have tried it. So if you go back to, say, Zimbabwe, they had a debt problem, and they didn't have the ability to borrow anymore, and so they just printed money, as like the modern monetary theorists would suggest, and we know exactly what happened. This is what a typical unit of Zimbabwe currency looked like at the beginning of their debt problem, and at the end, this is what it looked like. So they basically went from carrying around $50 Zimbabwe dollar notes to carrying around $100 trillion notes. And of course, these weren't very different in value, just a few years apart. And that's basically what happens if you try to deal with debt with printing money. You basically get very, very high inflation, and that's not something I expect that we'll be doing. I don't think the Federal Reserve would easily go in for this. But I note, by the way, in this current campaign, there's a big difference between the two candidates and how they view the independence of the Federal Reserve. Donald Trump has said that he thinks he as president should have more influence on monetary policy, whereas Kamala Harris has said she's going to maintain the independence of the Federal Reserve. So what's the other way we can deal with this debt. The other is to rein in spending. There's a famous quotation from Peter Fisher, who was a Treasury Department official in the first Bush administration. He once referred to the federal government as an insurance company with an army. And by that, he meant that a lot of the things that we do is providing a form of social insurance, things like Social Security and health programs. And here you can see the big role that these health programs and Social Security are in the federal government budget and how they're growing over time. And this discretionary part includes the army, the military spending. So can we deal with this debt issue by reining in spending? Sure, we can in principle. Will we be able to do so? Well, I doubt we'll be able to seriously reduce military spending, especially given the uncertain world we live in right now. And this insurance part, whether it's Social Security or health programs, those are pretty popular and pretty hard to cut back on. So I have certain things I would like to see. I would love to see, say, the retirement age rise for the eligibility for these programs. But that's actually politically quite unpopular. And so I can't see this happening politically. It seems unlikely to me that they would do this. There was several years ago when the Republicans in Congress were trying to scale back some of these social insurance programs. They're getting attacked politically quite severely over doing this. And if you may remember this particular ad, this is a still shot from a TV ad, and this is an actor who was playing Paul Ryan throwing grandma off the cliff. And the point is, the Republicans are trying to sort of balance the budget on grandma by basically killing grandma off. And I think that's the kind of ads you'll see more of if we really try to scale back these social insurance programs. So my guess is while we can certainly save some money there, trying to deal with the issue, fully solve the issue in this way is unlikely. That brings me back to the last way to deal with this, which is taxes. We could raise taxes. And that, in some ways, is the most plausible. Here's a comparison of the United States, which here at 24%, shows you the total government revenue as a share of GDP. The US is a low tax country. It's not the lowest tax country in the world, but it's a low tax country, especially compared to other economically advanced nations like those in Western Europe. So taxes in the United States tend to be very low. So I think the most plausible way economically of dealing with this long-term unsustainable trajectory is to raise taxes significantly above where they are today and where they have been historically. We've never had taxes as a share of GDP up at this level. That's true in Western European countries, but there's no reason we couldn't. And I think when I think of what's the likely outcome of this, I think it's going to be something like significantly higher taxes and not moving all the way in the direction of Western Europe, moving a fair amount in that direction. Now, the trouble with that is it's politically very difficult. There's an old chestnut in Washington that there's two parties. There's the stupid party and the evil party. And sometimes the stupid party and evil party get together and do something that's both stupid and evil, and that's called bipartisanship. Well, there's a bipartisan agreement on tax policy for 99% of the population. Republicans aren't willing to raise taxes on anyone. The Democrats only want to raise taxes in the top 1%. So for the bottom 99% of Americans, neither party wants to raise taxes. That's the bipartisan agreement that I will suggest is both stupid and evil. Because I think it's actually impossible to deal with our long-term trajectory with only saying we're going to tax 1% of the population more. So we really need a broad-based tax that would affect all Americans to raise a significant amount of revenue to close the fiscal gap that we're facing. So what tax would that be? Well, I think the tax, if you look at Western Europe or basically other countries, the one tax they have that we do not have is the value-added tax. A value-added tax is basically a form of consumption tax. It's actually very closely related to the Hall-Rabushka flat tax or the David Bradford's X tax. And economists of all stripes have suggested over the years that taxing consumption rather than income is a more efficient tax. And I think that's basically right. And I think if I had to come up with a solution to these problems, I would say what we really need is a broad-based tax. Now, I would start off, by the way, with something like a carbon tax. I've been a big believer in carbon taxes as a way of dealing with climate change, but um, I don't think the carbon tax by itself is going to raise enough to put the fiscal trajectory on a sustainable path. I do think we'll need something more, and I think a value-added tax is the way to go. Now, why do I think we'll likely get a value-added tax at some point? Well, here is a map showing the countries in the world that have value-added taxes. So the countries in pink here have value-added taxes. The countries in blue do not. And you see most countries have value-added taxes. The blue is really a very small subset of countries. So most of the world has decided that a value-added tax is the way to go. So I'm guessing that the United States is going to regress towards the mean and get a value-added tax. We came very close to getting that actually just a few years ago, back when they were doing corporate tax reform in the first Trump administration. Paul Ryan, who's really very much of a tax nerd. He came from the Ways and Means Committee before he was Speaker of the House. He proposed reforming the corporate income tax into what he called a business activity tax. If you look at the nuts and bolts of the business activity tax, it was very, very close to a value-added tax. So I think there is a feeling in Washington that something along the lines of a value-added tax makes sense, and most of the world does it. My guess is at some point we will have to do it. We have to do it before we have a crisis, or will we have to wait for a crisis before we do something dramatic? I don't know. Right now, there's no one in favor of this. The closest I know of is Andrew Yang ran in favor of a value-added tax, but he wanted to use all the value-added tax revenue to fund the universal basic income. I think we could certainly use some of the value-added tax for something like that if you want to make the whole package progressive. But I think we need to use some of the revenue from a value-added tax for closing the very large fiscal gap that we have. Let me close before taking questions with my favorite cartoon from the New Yorker. This is a bunch of economic advisors huddled around. I assume this is the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. You can see the Washington Monument in the background there. And they say, our deficit reduction plan is simple, but it will require a great deal of money. And I think that really does summarize what the fiscal challenge that we have ahead of us is. It's not hard to close the fiscal gap. We know how to do it. We need to either spend less or tax more. And I think we have tax instruments that we know can raise a lot of money. So in some sense, it's very simple. Just put a value-added tax on. But of course, if you're in Washington, it's not just economists getting together and deciding a plan. You got to sell the plan to the general public, and you got to convince the politicians that they're not going to lose their jobs if they endorse the plan. And right now, we're not there. I'm sure any politician who endorses a broad-based value-added tax now would quickly be looking for a job at the Kennedy School or some other public policy school, because I don't think they'd be in Congress much longer. So we're very far politically from putting us on a sustainable path. But there's ways to get there, and I hope that we will at some point, before we have a true financial crisis, we get there in a responsible way. So let me sort of stop there. I'm going to stop sharing screens and turn the floor back over to my colleagues at Macmillan.
Thank
And
you.
we'll take I think Scott has a few things to say, and then I want to take some questions.
Yes, well, I'm going to take a moment to show people something in Achieve from Greg's intermediate macro book. And while I'm doing that, please submit questions in the QA. I see we've got one. Someone sent me one on email earlier as well. So we have two kind of questions queued up, but we're here available to take questions. So please take advantage of that. What you see on my screen is the homework, the assessment assignments from Greg Mankiw's 12th edition of Macroeconomics and Achieve. And what I wanted to show you quickly was the AI tutor that we've baked into this. So here's the problem, and the student can submit their first attempt. And if they don't get the problem right, they can go to this AI tutor and ask it questions about the problem. It won't give them the answer, but it can say something like, I don't know which curve, they probably wouldn't call it a curve, maybe they will, they're intermediate, to shift. And the tutor will begin to prompt them Socratically to try to get them to learn this material, to help them along the way. So it's a personalized tutor that students have with them 24/7 as they're doing their assignments. What happens to national savings? It goes down. This might be wrong, but I'm just okay. Yes, I got it right. Yay. So I will continue to have this conversation to arrive at the right answer. And again, is the answer. As you can see here, it will not give me the answer. This is in Achieve. Achieve access is free for any instructors on this call. In our follow-up email with the recording, I will give you a way to easily request this from us. So I just wanted to quickly show folks that. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go to the QA part of the program. And now we have 4 in there. I'm going to take them in the order that they came. Greg, I don't know if you see them, but I'll read them out loud for everyone that may not be seeing them as well. Great lecture, Professor Mankiw. Question: of the 5 options, which one is the best economically, and which one do you think will happen politically?
I think the best option is to say, if we want bigger government, we want a robust safety net, which I think most of the public does. I mean, I would probably have a smaller government. I tend to lean in the libertarian direction. I'd have a smaller government, but I think most of the public wants a bigger government than I do. And I think if we are going to have a bigger government, we need to finance it. And so we need to finance it responsibly. And I think the way to finance it responsibly is with an efficient tax system. And I think much of the world has decided something along the lines of a value-added tax is a is sort of the most efficient tax system. I basically think that's right. So I think something like a value-added tax, maybe with some UBI component that makes the whole package progressive. I think that is probably the most responsible. Will that happen? There's no constituency for it now at all. And my fear is that that will become responsible only when we're forced to. That we'll have a crisis. And if we don't do this deliberately in advance, there's a lot of parts of the crisis that we might not like. So when I mentioned this Paul Tudor Jones interview, which I saw, I think it was just yesterday, and his view was, we're not going to take this thing seriously, and as a result, we're going to have lots of inflation in the future. That's conceivable to me. I hope that's not what we do. But I think the tendency that's in some sense maybe easier politically for people. Would we ever default? I certainly hope not. It's not inconceivable. That would be, I think, much more painful for the economy. So I think I fear that the politically expedient is not necessarily the economically best. I have enough optimism to think that at some point there'll be somebody who's willing to really take this very seriously. But I don't. But it'd be a politician that would be really sacrificing their political career in a big way. I mean, think back to George H.W. Bush, who basically lost the second term because of his breaking the pledge, we must live no new taxes. And his taxes were relatively modest compared to the tax increases we probably need to see now. So I'm fearful that we won't be responsible, but I'm optimistic also that at some point we will be.
Okay, thank you. Question 2, what about a wealth tax?
Yeah, I'm not a big. There's a lot of discussion lately of the wealth tax, and I think economists as a group are probably more divided on it. People who are very in favor of it are the group of economists at Berkeley. I mean, in particular, Manuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, who I believe advised Bernie Sanders and my senator Elizabeth Warren on the wealth tax, and they were running for president. I personally think wealth tax is going to be very hard to enforce, in part because lots of wealth is intangible and hard to measure. So, for example, imagine you're a musician. You have a lot of songs you've written. Those songs you have rights to those songs and future royalties off those songs. We know sometimes people sell their songbooks, right? You hear stories about investors buying the Rolling Stones songbook or something. So that's obviously a form of wealth, but it's not a tangible form of wealth. There's no market price for it. So trying to actually measure all forms of wealth is, I think, very difficult. And there's a spectrum of some wealth that's, you own stocks or bonds, that's very tangible and easy to measure. If you own a private series of laundromats, that's a form of wealth. You could probably appraise that. If you own a song book, a bunch of songs, you're a singer, that's harder to appraise and less tangible. If you have human capital, say a bunch of degrees, you're a physician, you have a medical degree, that's a form of wealth. Are we going to tax that? So I think wealth is such a difficult concept to get a handle on. Whereas I think consumption, which is what a VAT does, consumption is very easy to measure, and to my mind is probably the right tax base.
Thank you. The next question, isn't the Fed refinancing internally, and refinancing the debt internally, a way to reduce the rate of growth and reduce debt service?
Well, yeah, the Fed, I mean, there's a question as to what extent the fiscal policy dominates monetary policy. And you're absolutely right. Right. The question is right, that the Fed can do that. The Fed can buy bonds. And so I think the modern monetary theorists are right in the sense that we don't ever need to default on the debt. We could always print money, which is what the Fed does when it's basically when it's financing the government debt. But that necessarily involves creating money. And I don't think the quantity theory of money is the perfect theory of short-run inflation for every moment, but over a period of time, the quantity theory of money is right. And this is a quantity theory of money basically has a long history in economics. And I only learned actually this, in the past few years. The quantity theory of money actually goes back to Nicholas Copernicus, the guy who invented the sun-centered solar system. He's the first person to propose the quantity theory of money, and it has a long history going, from Nicholas Copernicus to David Hume to Milton Friedman and Irving Fisher. So there's lots of great economists who basically said the quantity theory of money is right, and at least in the long run. And so if we really do try to create lots of money and deal with our debt problems that way, I think that really is basically going down the inflation path. That, by the way, I don't that would I mean, that would address some of our debt problems. Because a lot of our debt is nominal, but some of our debt is real, and it's in inflation adjusted terms, so we can't really inflate away that. And some of it is implicit debt in the form of Social Security and Medicare for future payments to the elderly, and those payments are in real terms too. So you can't inflate away those implicit debts in the entitlement systems.
Thank you. Next question. Trump often uses the term economic growth solution to the fiscal problem. Of course, this would theoretically work, but empirically near impossible. Your additional thoughts?
Yeah, no, he's right. I mean, when he cut taxes back in 2017, he said, "Oh, this is going to raise the growth rate to 5 or 6% per year." And I think it did actually increase the growth. I think there's pretty good evidence that tax cuts do raise growth rates. The great paper by David and Christina Romer in the AER on this shows the tax cuts do have a powerful effect, but the level that he was suggesting, a 5 or 6%, it was just implausible, and of course, it didn't occur. People forget that many things that Donald Trump said didn't occur. I mean, people talk about his promises now, but think back then he was talking about 5 or 6% growth. We got a slight increase in growth during his administration, probably because of tax cuts, but certainly not the 5 or 6% that would make a big dent in the fiscal problems. Similarly, he said, "Oh, we're going to build a wall. Mexico's going to pay for it." As far as I know, Mexico never paid a dime for any wall. So I think he tends to make lots of promises. So I think Trump's right that faster growth would be great, but saying, "Oh, that we have the policy tools to generate it, enough growth to solve the problem," I think that's over optimistic. And I see there are some economists, by the way, who encourage this. I mean, I wrote a review of Trumponomics, which is a book by Steve Moore and Arthur Laffer in Foreign Affairs, and I don't like writing critical reviews. I don't like being mean, but it was a bad book. And I think they basically provided some comfort to those people who are thinking that, gee, these tax cuts would have miraculous effects. And they didn't. They had positive effects, but not miraculous.
We have sort of two questions about the value-added tax. I'm going to try to synthesize them, if you will. So you're suggesting a value-added tax How has that impacted debt in countries that are using it? And are we suggesting that value-added tax or a state that this moves from sort of a state level to a federal level? Because there's a perception that there may be some value-added taxes at the state level already.
Oh yeah, well we have. I mean, we don't have exactly value-added taxes at the state level. We do have sales taxes, which are very similar. I mean, I think of a value-added tax is kind of like a national sales tax, but rather than being collected all at the retail level, it's collected along the chain of production, which I think from a compliance standpoint is better. But from the economics standpoint, a value-added tax is very much like a retail sales tax. Um, I think what we've learned through other countries' experience is that it's really a very efficient way to raise money because those countries that have it tend to have much higher tax revenue to GDP ratios. So they actually do raise a lot of revenue that way. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why some opponents don't like it. They're afraid that it'll encourage the growth of government by allowing it. But my view is that the government's already grown. We just have to figure out how to pay for it now. And this is an efficient way to do it. One of the questioners I see on the chat asks, "Oh, is this regressive? It's going to raise prices?" And absolutely. I mean, somebody's there's going to be an incidence of a tax. Every tax has an incidence, and the incidence of a value-added tax is on consumers. And the incidence is going to be basically proportional to your consumption, and as a result, that's going to hit everybody across the board. So that's why if you're promised like Joe Biden, they're not going to tax anybody makes less than 400,000 a year, you can't go around this route. You can't go to a value-added tax. You can't even go to a carbon tax because there's no way to only tax people making more than 400,000 a year. Can you make the overall thing progressive? It depends on what you do with the money. What Andrew Yang was going to do was going to use the revenue from value-added tax to fund the UBI, Universal Basic Income. If you use some of it for that, then the overall package is progressive, even if the particular tax is regressive. So you got to think about the overall system, not just one piece of it. Similarly, I've been part of a group I'll call the Climate Leadership Council that has proposed putting on a carbon tax and using the revenue to give people lump sum, what we call carbon dividends, equal dividends from the carbon tax to all households. The carbon tax by itself is regressive, but the overall plan, including the dividends, is progressive. So I think whenever you think about fiscal policy, you can't think about particular tools in isolation. You have to think about the overall system.
Thank you. There are a lot about the value added I feel like you've touched on. I'm going to go to this one here. Why do you think the two candidates aren't proposing good economic plans to combat the debt crisis? Is the U.S. public is not oblivious to the problem. It is a big problem. So why hasn't there been a concrete plan? What are some of the political underpinnings that dissuade the two candidates from putting forth said
I think
plan?
basically one of my favorite books about the borderline between economics and political science is a book by Brian Kaplan, who's a professor at George Mason. It's called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And one of the things he does is he documents a lot of ways in which typical voters don't really understand economics. And he also talks about how if you're a voter, you have given that your probability of being influential in the election is trivial, your incentive to actually go learn economics is very small. So so his view is voters have irrational beliefs and have no incentive to correct their own irrationality. I think in the case of what's going on right now in the body politic, both candidates are trying to appeal to a small number of undecided voters. And I think at this point, there are fairly few of them. My guess is that most people who are very well informed probably are not undecided at this point. I don't think Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are so similar that a well-informed voter is thinking, they seem kind of the same to me. The people who are really kind of undecided are probably people who are less engaged in public policy, less engaged in the political process, less knowledgeable about economics. So when they're putting forth policies, they're not putting policies to appeal to the smartest voters who have probably already made up their mind. They're appealing to these people who are sort of on the fence. So taking one example that both candidates have chosen, no tax on tips. I follow the public finance literature pretty closely, I don't think any professional public finance economist has ever proposed no tax on tips. It's not considered a smart policy because why should tip income be different from other income? Um, so why are they doing that? Well, obviously it's pandering. I mean, as Donald Trump suggested originally, obviously it was getting some legs politically, and um, so Kamala Harris sort of picked it up to propose it. I'm pretty sure to do that you need a congressional law passed. You can't do this by executive order. I don't think Congress is going to pass that. I can't see that making pass the Ways and Means Committee.
I'm just trying to figure where we can go for. How about this one? Inheritance tax. What about an inheritance tax? Greatest inequality happens at birth.
Um, you know, here, I'm a skeptic of the inheritance tax. I mean, let me give you the parable about why I'm a skeptic. Imagine you have two people. I'm going to call them Sam Spendthrift and Franny Frugal. Sam, they both start companies. They both make a lot of money. They're both worth let's say both the companies both go public. They're both worth, say, $15 million. And then Sam Spencer says, "Oh, I'm really wealthy. What I want to do is I want to sort of buy myself a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, private jet, and he's just going to spend all his money during his life." Franny Frugal says, "Oh, I've been very lucky. I don't want to spend all the stuff, all of my money on myself. I want to save it. I'm going to live more frugally, more modestly. I'm going to save it and put it in a trust fund for my kids and grandkids and nephews and nieces." Now, the inheritance tax basically says, "Oh, we really should tax Fannie Frugal more than Sam Spendthrift, because Sam Spendthrift is spending all the money on himself. He's not leaving any inheritance, whereas Fannie Frugal is leaving it to her extended family." I don't see any justice in saying that um, Fannie Frugal deserves to pay higher taxes than Sam Spendthrift. In fact, under my value-added tax, by the way, Sam Spendthrift would pay higher because he'd be paying the value-added tax on his private jet and his Ferrari and all the other stuff he spends. I'm not. So I don't actually see a inheritance tax as a particularly just tax. But I know people seem to have strong opinions about it, and in any event, it's probably not. Even if we go back to the thresholds and rates that we had previously, I don't think that's going to raise a lot of revenue compared to the size of the fiscal imbalance. So I think that's only a small piece.
Get over there. You know you were wrong. Thank you. There was one I wanted to find here and I'm missing it. Oh, here we go. Thank you for the session. What impact does the USA's ballooning debt have on developing nations?
On developing nations, that's a good question. One thing it does is it causes trade deficits. I mean, one of the basic, this is something I teach in my textbooks. We talk about one of the impacts of I mean, this is a phrase that actually goes back to Marty Feldstein, I think, the idea of a twin deficits, that a budget deficit lead to a trade deficit and therefore a capital inflow. So the extent that we, as the United States, don't save as much, capital flows in from the rest of the world, including from some developing countries. So I think deficits raise the cost of capital around the world by reducing world saving. And as a result, sort of crowd out capital, not just in the United States, but abroad. I should know, by the way, in their current campaign, there's a lot of talk about trade deficits, and there's certain people who think that trade deficits are basically a problem involving trade barriers and trade agreements. And I think most economists who study international trade don't think that trade deficits are primarily about trade agreements, or trade barriers. They're primarily about savings and investment. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about trade, about what causes trade deficits. And I'm afraid that misunderstanding is actually leading towards sort of high tariff policies that are probably bad for both the United States and our trading partners around the world. So one of the unintended effects of these big budget deficits is a focus on international trade in a way that's not terribly healthy.
Thank you. We'll go to this one. Some proponents of modern monetary theory argue that sovereign debt isn't an issue for countries like the US that issue their own currency. What's your critique of MMT in this context of the current fiscal challenges, and how might its principles either exacerbate or mitigate long-term risks, long-term debt
Yeah,
risks?
no, I mean, I agree with. I'm not. I refer the questioner to this very short thing I wrote for the Papers and Proceedings that I sort of cited in my talk. I think they're absolutely right that we don't need to ever default because we can always print our own money. So I think that's right. We can always print our own money. Does that mean that's a wise thing to do to print our own money? Well, no, because I think it could be inflationary. And I think the part of MMT that I am more skeptical of is the theory of inflation that basically doesn't recognize the quantity theory of money as the right long run theory of inflation. That eventually, if you print a lot of money, you get inflation. I think that lesson, which goes back a very centuries, um, I think is basically true. And so if push comes to shove, would we really, if we had a crisis, would we choose to go to the high inflation route? We might decide that, we don't have to default. We could print money. We might decide that defaulting is a better solution than going to hyperinflation. So, so while I agree with the MMT people that we don't need to default, we can always print our own money. I'm not sure that means we always will print our own money, or should print our own money. So, I go into a little more detail in the paper. There was actually a textbook it was actually an intermediate macro textbook that sort of was organized around MMT principles, and my article was sort of like a book review of that book, but I was using the book really as a touchstone for MMT more generally. I wasn't particularly interested in that book, but that book I think was the best sort of summary of MMT views that was out there at the time.
We get a number of VAT questions. I'm going to try to kind of synthesize them into one. It essentially seems to be like, what would be a fair and equitable VAT approach? That seems to be some of the concern that we're seeing from a number of questioners in terms of it not being of it impacting less wealthy people more so
You
than
know, no,
people in means.
if we want bigger government, and we seem to because we're spending much more than we're taking in revenue. I think we all need to pay for it. And I think the idea that we're expecting to balance the budget only in the backs of the 1% is not realistic, because I think at some point they do get close to the peak of their Laffer curve. If you're somebody living in, say, California today, um, you're paying 37% for the federal government, and you're paying about 13% in the state government without the state and local tax deductions. So there's no relief in that, and plus a few percent in Medicare. So you're paying basically a little over 50% of your marginal income. We could raise that a little bit, but I don't think we can raise that too much, because I think at some point they do reach the peak of the Laffer curve. I think if we really want bigger government, we all have to pay for it. It has to be a broad-based tax. That's not a politically popular thing to say, but I think it's basically true. Now, if you look at Europe, Europe has much bigger government than we do. They don't do it by taxing the rich particularly more than we do. They do it by having broad-based taxes on the middle class. They do it through things like a value-added tax. So I think somebody has to level with the American people, saying, if we want bigger government, we all have to chip in to pay for it. And I think that is politically a hard lesson to learn. It's much easier to say, don't worry, 99% of voters, you don't have to pay. We're just going to have the 1% pay. And that's a much easier thing to say from the stump. And I think there's some ways we can certainly raise taxes on the rich. For example, I think the treatment of carried interest is screwy. But I think by and large, most of the wealthy people are paying a lot. And I think trying to ask them to pay more is probably difficult. So I think we can close some of the loopholes like carried interest. But basically, I think what we need is a broader base tax and move in a direction more like Europe, where they get more services from the government than we do, but also everyone pays more taxes than we do.
Here's an interesting one. Where do your macro beliefs lean in the RBC slash rational expectations slash monetarist slash New Keynesian spectrum? And has
Yeah.
it changed over time? And if so, why?
I came into economics in the 1970s. I started grad school in 1980. I was a student of Ellen Blinder in college, and in grad school, I was a student of Larry Summers um, and Stan Fisher, and those people had a deep influence on me. And I think that those people probably profoundly influence how I see the world. So I think I view myself. I'm often associated with the New Keynesian school. The New Keynesian school, I think, borrowed a lot from the monetarist school. So I think the New Keynesians were really a merger of the old monetarists and the old Keynesians, and in some ways were a reflection of the times, and in particular, in response to the real business cycle school developed at the time. So the typical New Keynesian model builds in some rational expectations, but not necessarily all. This work I've done on sticky information is a semi-rational expectations world. It's basically saying you have rational expectations based on limited information sets. I think the RBC world that says business cycles are all driven by exogenous technology shocks and money's neutral. I think that approach to the business cycle has pretty much faded away by now. And I've actually reduced the coverage of that in my intermediate book as it has faded away. But I think sort of the standard view of the world now, which is some version of New Keynesian economics married to, say, some heterogeneous agent model of the consumer. I think that, I mean, sometimes they're called Hank models, heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models. That's a sort of a very prominent school of thought right now. A lot of that, I see the foundation of that coming in the work that was being done when I was a student and an early system professor along with myself and people like Mike Woodford and David Romer and Larry Ball, Olivier Blanchard, Jordy Galley. So I think that the sort of the current consensus uh, is basically is now founded on those set of tools that were built really starting in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Interesting question. I think worth a little bit beyond the topic. What's the best way to regulate or tax the big tech or similar dominant firms and redistribute the wealth?
Oh, that's well, isn't it? There's a completely unrelated question about from fiscal policy, which is antitrust policy, and it's never an issue foremost in voters' minds during campaigns, but I think it is one of the ways in which the two political parties differ. The Biden administration has taken a much more aggressive stance on antitrust issues than previous administrations. And in particular, he appointed Lina Khan to be head of the Federal Trade Commission. And Lina Khan has taken a much broader approach to the application of things like the Sherman Antitrust Act to competition. So, for example, the recent case for Apple, which is basically saying Apple's required to make their devices more compatible with things like Android smartphones and so on. So she's very much pushing the envelope on what antitrust is doing. Um, Also, this suggests that maybe they break up Google is another sort of example of this. My sense is that she's lost more cases at the court level than she's won. So I think the courts have thought that she's sort of she's above her going. What's this expression? She's a bit over her skis on this. That she's going a little too far in pushing where antitrust policy can go. It'll be interesting, and I'm sure if Trump wins, he'll put somebody there who's going to um, rein that back. And I'm sure that's why some tech people like Elon Musk are favoring Trump, because they don't want a heavy regulatory approach. What we don't know is what Kamala Harris will do in that. She's not talking about it because it's not a main issue among swing voters, but it's an important issue for the economy. And so on the one hand, she has she's been in the Biden administration, so she's been in this environment where they've taken a much more active approach to antitrust policy. On the other hand, she comes from California and has lots of ties to the high-tech community there, so she may be a little more sympathetic to their concerns. So so it'll be, I don't know which way which way she'll go, but my guess is the Lena Khan approach is basically going to lose because I think the courts have been pushed back really hard against her, and I think some more middle of the road, more traditional antitrust approach is probably where we're going to be heading.
Okay, I feel obligated to take this one. I use Mankiw because it's the only textbook that has ISLM. Hope this does not become extinct. This, not a question, but I think you could probably address that comment.
Yes, well, I am a believer that ISLM is a foundational idea. It's not the end end of thinking about economic fluctuations, and that's why I have this chapter in the intermediate book on what's called the dynamic model of economic fluctuations, which builds on ISLM but tries to move in the direction of more recent DSGE models. It requires a little bit more math in the other chapters, but I think the ISLM model still is a foundational idea, and I have no plans to take it out of the book. It's certainly there in the most recent edition.
Okay, we have time for like probably one or two more. Is increasing the debt level destroying the American dream of home ownership?
Well, it's certainly increasing debt levels push up interest rates, and that makes mortgages more expensive. Um, uh, you know, I think two things are going on with regard to home ownership. I think part of it is interest rates are now high relative to where they were a few years ago. Oh, they're not high relative to where they were historically. So I think mortgage rates are not. If you take a broad view of history, the mortgage rates are kind of normal now. But we're also we also had a period of 30 years of rising income inequality, and so I think for people who don't have college degrees, their incomes are not sufficient to easily afford home ownership. So I think it's a combination of homes being expensive and people at the bottom of the educational ladder not getting the wage increases that the more educated workers have gotten. You should know, by the way, as long as the inequalities come up, in the most recent edition of the intermediate book, we've integrated the discussion of income inequality as a much more central part of the book in chapter 3, I guess it is.
And as I mentioned when I was showing the AI tutor, happy to send access to anyone that wants access to the ebook with Achieve and all the homework. And we could also send you a print examiner desk copy if needed. So you'll get a follow-up from me and I'll be able to take care of any of those needs on your end. I think we have time for one more. Just want to thank everyone for coming. We do hope to hear from you. We will be sharing the recording. You can share it out with colleagues if you'd like. And again, if you need anything from Macmillan, you can just reply directly to that. It comes right into my inbox, and I tend to be rather responsive, so you won't have to wait long. Even though I am going to
People can
be
also
out
email
for
me
a
too,
couple
by the
days.
way. My
Oh,
email is on my Harvard website. Anyone feel free to email me if they have questions, comments.
okay, that's great. But if you want a desk copy, I think you should
No,
probably
I
come
can't
to
get a
me
desk
and
copy.
not to Greg. Yes.
I don't do that.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. Given the unprecedented scale of U.S. national debt and its projected trajectory, how do you assess the potential risks of a debt spiral or sovereign debt crisis in the long term?
Well, I'm worried about it. Initially, Paul Tudor Jones, who I mentioned earlier about that quote, he's worried about it. He said he would own no long-term bonds in his portfolio because he's worried about exactly that. The bond market is not worried about it. And so if you look at sort of long-term government bonds, they don't seem to reflect any premium that anything that's going to involve, like say, high inflation or default or anything like that. So the bond market seems relatively calm. But it's been well known that that crises take longer to occur than you think, but then when they occur, they happen very fast. And so I wouldn't be shocked if we had one in the next 10 years. I wouldn't necessarily say it's likely. I'm still owning some bonds, but maybe a shorter duration than I would have otherwise held, because I do think there is a risk. The basic laws of macroeconomics that we see play out in, let's say, Greece or Argentina or other countries that are default on their debt, they're not different laws from the United States. The United States, can easily sell its debt only because people trust us. But trust can be easily squandered if we don't do the right thing. I still think we have a basically. I'm optimistic about American institutions. I'm optimistic we'll eventually do the right thing, but there's no evidence yet that either political party is ready to do it.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you to our attendees for your time. We really do appreciate it, and we will be in contact with the recording. Let us know if we can help in any way. Have a great rest of your week, and hope to talk soon. Goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you.